On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations Her Excellency Dilma Rousseff, President of the Federative Republic of Brazil, and to invite her to address the Assembly.
Senor Morgan.
Mr. Morgan Zeligatov, the President of the 70th General Assembly of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state, heads of government, and heads of delegation, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege to address the General Assembly of the UN this year when the United Nations organization celebrate their 70th anniversary. My very first remarks, Mr. President, are to congratulate you for having been chosen to preside over this General Assembly. May I reiterate in particular Brazil's support to your willingness to put in place measures that will ultimately strengthen the organization's development agenda. 70 years have gone by since the San Francisco Conference. On that occasion, the purpose was to build a world anchored on international law and on the pursuit of peaceful resolution of conflicts. Since then, we have experienced progress and setbacks. The decolonization process has evolved remarkably, as we can clearly see just by looking at the very makeup of this assembly. The United Nations has since expanded its initiatives, and it has incorporated the 2030 Development Agenda as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, those issues concerning the environment, the end of poverty, social and economic development, as well as access to quality services. Issues such as urban challenges, gender issues involving both women and children, race issues have all gained priority on the agenda. However, it has not achieved the same success in addressing collective security, an issue that was at the very origin of the organization and at the very center of its concerns. The proliferation of regional conflicts, some of which have a highly destructive potential, as well as the spread of terrorism, killing men, women and children, destroying human heritage, and expelling millions of people from their long-established communities show all too well that the United Nations currently finds itself before a great challenge. One cannot be complacent with acts such as those perpetrated by the so-called Islamic states and by other associated groups, barbaric acts. The situation today, to a large extent, explains the refugee crisis currently facing humankind. A substantial portion of men, women, and children who dangerously venture the waters of the Mediterranean and who painfully wander along the roads of Europe come from the Middle East and from Northern Africa, where countries, state institutions have been destructured by military actions contrary to international law, thus making room for the proliferation of terrorism. The deep sense of indignation caused by the picture of a dead Syrian boy on the beaches of Turkey and by the news on the 71 persons asphyxiated inside a truck in Austria should be translated into unmistakable acts of practical solidarity. In a world where goods, capital, information, and ideas circulate freely, it is absurd to prevent the free movement of people. Brazil is a welcoming country, a country that was ultimately made up by refugees. We have received Syrians, Haitian, men and women from all over the world. We, for more than a century now, have provided shelter to millions of Europeans, Arabs, and Asian citizens. We remain open. We have our arms open to welcome refugees. We are a multi-ethnic nation. We are a multi-ethnic country that coexists with differences and knows all too well the importance of differences to ultimately make us stronger, richer, and more diverse, both culturally and socially, as well as economically. Mr. President, this disquieting backdrop I just described, this requires that we reflect on the future outlook for the United Nations and requires that we act concretely and rapidly. We need the United Nations organization that is capable of fostering sustainable peace on the international front and capable of working swiftly and effectively in situations of war, regional crisis, localized regional crisis as appropriate, and against any acts against humankind. One cannot, for example, postpone the creation of a Palestinian state, one that will live peacefully and harmoniously with Israel. Likewise, one cannot possibly tolerate the expansion of settlements in the territories or the occupied territories. That is not acceptable. In order to give the United Nations the central role it is rightfully entitled to, it is absolutely key and essential that a comprehensive reform of its structures be carried out. The UN Security Council must expand its permanent and non-permanent members in order to become more representative, more legitimate, and more effective. The majority of member states does not wish a decision on this respect to be forever postponed. We are hopeful that the session that we are starting here today will enter into history as the turning point in the trajectory of the United Nations organization. We hope that it will bring about tangible, concrete results in the long and so far inconclusive reform process of the UN. In our region of the world where peace and democracy prevail, we are delighted to see the resumption of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States of America, an event that puts an end to a dispute stemming way back from the Cold War. We hope that this process will be completed with the end to the embargo that is currently imposed upon Cuba. We likewise welcome and celebrate the recent agreement achieved with Iran. We likewise welcome and hail the recent agreement achieved with Iran, which will enable this country to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes and thus return the hope for peace to an entire region. At the BRICS level, we have launched a new development bank which will help further expand trade flows and investments and will also possibly help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Mr. President, the 2030 Agenda sketches out the future we all want. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals reaffirm the tenet of the Rio Plus 20 conference, i.e., the principle that it is possible to grow, include, preserve, and protect. They set universal targets and as such highlight the need for further cooperation among peoples of the world and show humankind a shared path ahead. The 2030 Agenda requires global solidarity as well as determination from each and every one of us and a sense of commitment to tackle climate change and to overcome poverty and extreme poverty while building opportunities for all. In Paris, next December, we should work to further strengthen the climate convention by ensuring that its tenets be fulfilled and its principles respected. The obligations we take on in Paris should be ambitious in scope and nature, to include financial and technological support to developing countries and to small island states, in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Brazil is making a substantial effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without nevertheless impairing our development. We continue to diversify the renewable sources in our energy mix, one of the world's cleanest energy mixes. We are currently also investing in low-carbon agriculture. We have reduced deforestation in the Amazonian region by 82%. A sense of ambition will continue to guide our actions. Accordingly, just yesterday I announced here at the United Nations Brazil's INDC, Brazil's contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 will be of 43% vis-à-vis the 2005 baseline year. In this time horizon, Brazil intends to ensure the end to illegal deforestation, plus reforestation of 12 million hectares, recovery of 15 million hectares of pasture lands, degraded pasture lands, as well as the integration of 5 million hectares of crop, livestock, and forestry practices. In a world where the share of renewable sources of energy accounts for just 13% on average in the overall energy mix worldwide, we intend to ensure a 45% share of renewable sources in our domestic energy mix. To that end, we will pursue 60% as the share of hydro sources in electricity generation, and a share of 23% of renewable sources, such as wind, solar, and biomass, in electrical energy generation, an increase of about 10% in energy efficiency, as well as a share of 16% of fuel ethanol and of other sugarcane-derived biomasses in the overall energy mix. Brazil is thus contributing for the world to be in a position to fulfill the recommendations issued by the Climate Change Panel. The recommendations set a limit of no more than 2 degrees Celsius in temperature increase for this century. We are one of the few developing countries to take on an absolute emissions reduction target. Our INDC further includes actions that increase environmental resilience and reduce the risks associated to the negative effects stemming from climate change on the poorest and the most vulnerable populations, with special attention to gender issues, workers' rights, the rights of indigenous, former black, slave, and traditional communities. We recognize the importance of South-South cooperation in the global effort to combat climate change. May I stress that since 2003, social and income transfer policies have helped more than 36 million Brazilians to overcome extreme poverty. Last year, Brazil was officially taken out of the World Hunger Map. This highlights the efficacy, the effectiveness of our so-called zero hunger policy, which has now evolved to become Sustainable Development Goal number 2 in the 2030 agenda. In the transition to a low-carbon economy, we believe it is important to ensure dignified and fair conditions to workers. Sustainable development requires promotion of decent labor, creation of quality jobs, and guaranteed opportunities for all. The effort to overcome poverty and advance development must be collective and global in scope. In my country, however, we know all too well that the end to extreme poverty is just the beginning of a long path marked by new gains. Mr. President, for 6 years, we have sought to prevent the effects of the world crisis that broke up in 2008 in the developed world. We have been working to prevent the effects of that crisis from affecting our economy and society. For 6 years on end, we have adopted a broad array of different measures, including a reduction of taxes, expansion of loans, and reinforcement of investments, and boosting household consumption patterns. We have increased employment opportunities and income levels in that period. That effort has now come to its limit, not only due to domestic fiscal reasons, but also due to reasons pertaining to the external state of affairs. The slow recovery of the world's economy and the end of the supercycle of commodities have had a negative impact on our growth. Foreign exchange depreciation and recession pressures have produced inflation and a strong drop in tax collection, thus resulting in restrictions to government accounts. However, Brazil does not have any serious structural problems. Our problems are very much limited to the current circumstances. And in view of that state of affairs, we are now rebalancing our budget, and we have undertaken a strong, substantial reduction in government spending, running expenses, and even part of investments. We have realigned prices. We are currently passing permanent spending reduction measures, and we have proposed drastic cuts in expenses, and we have redefined our revenues. All of these initiatives are aimed at reorganizing the fiscal framework while reducing inflation and consolidating macroeconomic stability and increasing confidence in the economy while ensuring a resumption of growth with income distribution. Today, the Brazilian economy is stronger, it is more solid and more resilient than it was years ago. We are in a position to overcome the current difficulties and move on in the development path. We are at a transition point in time, moving towards a new cycle of expansion that will be more profound, more solid, and more long-lasting. In addition to the fiscal and financial rebalancing actions and stimuli to exports, we have also put in place measures to encourage investments in infrastructure and energy. In Brazil, the social inclusion process has not been interrupted. We hope that inflation control and resumption of growth and credit availability will ultimately contribute to further expand household consumption patterns. These are the bases, the foundations underlying the new cycle of growth and development based on increased productivity and on investment opportunities for companies and more job opportunities for citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, the gains we have achieved in the past few years were established in an environment of consolidation and deepening of our democracy. Thanks to the effective legal framework and the vigorous democratic institutions, the workings of the Brazilian states have come under scrutiny, firm and impartial scrutiny by the powers and the government agencies in charge of investigating, ascertaining, and punishing any wrongdoing. The Brazilian government and society do not and will not tolerate corruption. The Brazilian democracy is made stronger when government officials take the limit set in the law as their own limit. We Brazilians want to have a country where the law is ultimately the applicable limit. Many of us fought for that, precisely at a point in time when rights and laws were violated under the military dictatorship. We want to have a country where government leaders will behave strictly in line with their job duties without ever yielding to excesses. A country where judges will judge and try cases freely, impartially, without any pressures whatsoever, and totally divorced from any political partisan passions, and never compromising with the established assumption of innocence of any citizen. We want a country where the opposition of ideas takes place in an environment of civility and respect. We want a country where the freedom of the press be one of the foundations of the right to one's own opinion and the expression of dissenting views, a right to all Brazilian nationals. Legal sanctions should apply to all of those who have practiced unlawful acts in due observance with the adversarial system and the principle of ample defense. These are the foundations of our democracy. And may I use a recent quote from my friend, José Mujica, former president of Uruguay, who said, "This democracy is not perfect because we are not perfect, but we must defend it in order to improve it and not to bury it." Let me state for the record that Brazil will keep on moving in the democratic pathway, and we will never give up the gains for which we have fought so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to use this opportunity to reiterate that Brazil has her arms open to welcome citizens from all over the world for the upcoming 2016 Olympic and Paralympic Games to be held in Rio de Janeiro. We look forward to welcoming all of you. It will be a unique opportunity to showcase and disseminate sports as a key tool in the promotion of peace, social inclusion, tolerance, through efforts to tackle racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination. It will also be an occasion for us to advance the inclusion of people with disabilities, one of the top priorities of my administration. One final word. Just a few days ago, here at the headquarters of the United Nations organizations, the mural paintings titled War and Peace were again presented to the public, a work by Brazilian artist Cândido Portinari, and which were donated to the United Nations by my government or the government of my country back in 1957. The work denounces and portrays violence and stark poverty, and it further urges peoples of the world to seek mutual understanding. It stands as a symbol to the United Nations organization as regards its ultimate responsibility to avoid armed conflicts and to promote peace, social justice, and to overcome hunger and poverty. Portinari often stated that there can be no great work of art that is not totally identified with people around it. The message of those mural paintings remains very current and topical. It speaks to not only the victims of wars, but also to the refugees who risk their lives on precarious boats. It also speaks to all of those anonymous lives who turn to the UN for protection, peace, and well-being. We hope that as we walk into these premises of the United Nations and as we look at these paintings at the very entrance, we hope that we will be able to hear the voices of those people whom we represent and to work hard to ensure that their yearnings for peace and progress will be met. After all, these were the very ideals that 70 years ago were present at the very foundation of the United Nations organization, a major accomplishment of humankind. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, all.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Federative Republic of Brazil for her statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated